Hi, and welcome back to Sarasota, Florida. I'm Lyle with C&S Corvettes. Today we're going to be reviewing the proper replacement procedures for the 1963 to 1982 Corvette power steering control valve, as reproduced and refurbished by Lone Star Caliper out of Texas. We will be using their instructions today because they are the best in the business at what they do. Let's go over some of the tools you're going to need to properly do this job. First, a pair of side cutters or even a pair of pliers. Those are going to be used mostly to remove cotter pins that are locking things in place on the assembly. This way, using side cutters, you can usually get them off without destroying them. Next, you're going to use what we call line wrenches. They have special ends on them that allow you to remove brake and hydraulic lines without stripping off the casings. Very important. You don't want to round these things off, otherwise you're going to have to end up buying a whole bunch more parts to complete the job. The sizes we're using in this particular job are 7/16, ½ and 9/16. You're also going to need conventional wrenches, either combo or double-ended, 9/16, 3/4 inch. You will need what we call a pickle fork. We call it a pickle fork because if you don't have it by the time you get halfway through this job, you're going to be in a real pickle. And with any automotive job, we always recommend having a very large hammer on hand, because at one point you're going to hit the car with it or yourself with it before this job is done. Okay, now that we've got our tools laid out, the next part of the job is to get the car up in the air. If you have access to a lift like the one we've got here, by all means, using lift instructions, put it up safely. If you're doing this at home, you want to get the front of the car off the ground using a jack, but always use jack stands in safe locations. Never, ever, ever leaving the car just on the jack, because if it fails, you're never going to finish the job. Okay, now that the car's up in the air, let's go ahead and get the part out of the box to get started. You'll notice the very first thing you see are detailed instructions from Lone Star Caliper on how to do this safely and efficiently. Please read them and pay attention, because these are the guys who do it for a living. They really know what they're doing. Pull the part out and we're ready to go. With the car up in the air, as you can see, we removed the left front wheel so that we have a clear shot of everything we're going to be doing here. Looking into the wheel well, you see the power steering control valve right here. Please note, before you take anything apart, how these hoses cross. Top right to bottom left, bottom right, under it going up to top left, because you will need to replicate this when you install everything. It's also illustrated on the front of the directions. Now, this is a great time to look at the balance of the system to see what other things you may need. Check all 4 of your power steering hoses. If they appear to be worn or brittle, now's the time to replace them, because you're going to have to take them off anyway. Also, check the remainder of the power steering system. The slave cylinder is just inboard of the power steering control valve. If it is leaking or does not appear to be happy, replace that as well. At this point, go ahead and place a liquid containment unit underneath the power steering control valve, because when we take these hoses off, it's going to leak fluid all over your garage if you don't. We're ready to use our line wrench and remove these 2 lines and drain the unit. As you unhook the first 2 hoses, you may have noticed that they thread in and out at a slight angle. That's important to remember now, and even more important to remember when you're putting this back together to avoid cross-threading. Now that those are safely out of the way, go ahead and grab the correct size line wrench and remove the top 2 hoses right here. With those 2 hoses removed, go ahead and remove the valve clamp cap screw at the rear of the unit. You'll find it back here. For easy illustration, here's how the unit sits in the car. The valve clamp cap screw is right at the rear of it. We call it a bolt. Go ahead and remove that, and then turn the wheels of the car in the opposite direction, and that'll get us ready for our next step. Next step is we're going to remove the cotter pin and the nut from this tapered stud on top of the unit. This is what actually connects the power steering control valve to the pitman arm on the car. Once the pin and the nut are removed, this is where we use the pickle fork, as seen here, to separate the stud from the pitman arm. With the pitman arm now disconnected from the control valve, go ahead and unscrew the control valve from the end of the drag link. Take it off and set your defective core aside so you can return it for your core deposit. With the core set aside, we're now ready to go in and disconnect the cotter pin and the nut at the end of the slave cylinder shaft. Go ahead and do that and just let it hang down like this. With the slave cylinder hanging loose, it's now time to install the rebuilt power steering control valve by threading it onto the drag link and then locking it in place with the bolt at the rear. As you're installing that valve clamp cap screw, it's important to note that as you look through the holes at the back of the unit where that screw goes in, make sure it lines up with this indentation on the drag link itself. That's how the unit locks into its proper position. With the power steering control valve secured to the drag link, go ahead and reattach the control valve to the pitman arm by putting the stud up through the pitman arm and affixing the nut and the cotter pin. You'll want to torque that down to 45 foot-pounds, and while you're torquing, go ahead and torque this bolt to 25 foot-pounds. Now go ahead and reconnect all 4 hoses to their original positions. If you have any questions, go ahead and just refer to the diagram on the instructions for the front of the unit. Okay, now we've pretty much got the power steering control valve completely reinstalled, with the important exception of the slave cylinder shaft not being reattached to the frame bracket yet. That is meant to hang loose for now. Go ahead and fill the system with new good grade power steering fluid. With power steering reservoir full, start the engine momentarily and shut it off. Refill the pump reservoir as required. Repeat this until the pump reservoir level remains constant. We're now ready to begin the adjustment phase of this installation. To adjust this, I've actually got a different fresh power steering control valve in my hand because it's easier to show you where the adjustment nut is hidden on these things. The adjustment nut is located under this cap. We remove the cap. The adjustment nut I'm going to be speaking about in the next section is this nut right here. Now we're going to go ahead and start the engine. One of 2 conditions is going to exist. If the piston rod remains retracted as you see it here, turn the adjusting nut under this cap clockwise until the rod begins to move out like this. Then turn the nut counterclockwise until the rod just begins to move in. Now turn the nut clockwise exactly 1/2 the rotation needed to change the direction of the piston rod movement. Now, the other condition that would be possible is you start the engine and this rod extends out like this. If that's the case, you're going to turn that adjusting nut counterclockwise first until this rod starts to move back inward as such. Once you see it start to move that way, turn the nut clockwise until it begins to move back out this direction. Now position the nut 1/2 the rotation needed to change the direction of the piston rod movement back in. Don't turn this nut back and forth more than absolutely necessary to balance the valve, as this is a special friction nut. With the valve balanced, it should be possible to move the rod in and out manually, as I am doing now. At this point, turn off the engine and connect the cylinder rod to the frame bracket. Torque to specifications. It's important to notice, as you're putting the slave cylinder shaft back through the frame bracket, there are 2 flat spots on the inboard side of this shaft. That's where you're going to put one wrench to steady the shaft as you use your other wrench to secure the nut on the other side of the bracket. The wrenches involved are going to be 7/16 and 9/16 standards. Once the slave cylinder shaft has been reinstalled through the frame bracket, go ahead and start the engine of the car. Mind you, the wheels are still off the floor. Start the engine of the car. If the wheels don't move right or left on their own, it means that the valve is properly adjusted. Go ahead and shut off the engine, replace the cap on the front of your power steering control valve, and lower the car to the ground. This completes the installation video for the 63 to 82 power steering control valve. Once your vehicle's back on the ground, make sure there's no leaks, and check the drive belts for your power steering pump to make sure that they're tight and not glazed over, because if they are, now's the time to fix them. Thanks for joining us today. I hope this video has been helpful to you as you replace your power steering control valve. Any additional questions, you can contact Lone Star Caliper at lonestarcaliper.com. We'll see you next time.